As a kid who grew up in the 90s, I always found myself playing catch-up when it came to Kenner's 1986 Ghostbusters toy line. I had to mainly rely on flea markets and neighborhood garage sales to acquire most of my collection. This werewolf figure from their Monsters line was always one that I wanted, but all I could do was admire him from a card back I had. After all these years later, I just recently acquired this guy indirectly through eBay in a pile of random action figures, and as you can tell, he's in some serious distress. His right arm didn't even survive the trip to my house. Is this guy too far gone? Or can an amateur like myself save him? Okay, the two issues we'll address are his yellowed torso and his broken arm. Treating his body is something we can do without taking him apart, but unfortunately, in order to attach his arm, we'll need to crack him open. He doesn't have any screws, so we'll need to split the sonic weld. This can be pretty brutal, and it's always tricky, but with patience, it's certainly possible. I applied some heat from a hairdryer in attempts to soften up some of the 30-year-old adhesive inside. So take your time slowly separating with a small flathead screwdriver and possibly some needle nose pliers. Try using gaps in the figure as leverage, just like I'm using his vacant arm slot and neck opening. And that's exactly what you want to happen. Not really. Make sure you track down every piece. Now that he's disassembled, it's best to let the pieces sit for a few hours in warm water, and then give him a thorough scrubbing to get some of the surface gunk off. A toothbrush usually works best. Now, I'll quickly mention that I did attempt a bleach and OxyClean treatment, but this didn't really have too much effect. I've had some success with these methods before, but it really has to do with what kind of plastics you're using it on. I've also had some success with hydrogen peroxide treatments, but you'll lose most of the trim in the process. I was also recommended the product Retro Bright as an option, but no one has any idea what the long-term effects of that process is, so I'll be going with paint because that's just the safe bet. Okay, I have 2 base coats applied, and he's ready for his detail trim. After his trim, I finish him off with a very thin coat of sealer. Okay, aesthetically, he's looking great, but now he needs to function properly. Luckily, I have all of his broken pieces, so first I'll try to glue his shoulder socket back together. Now, I've been using the brand Loctite lately, and been very pleased with the results. His joints are extremely tight, so we'll need to make a mental note to not handle him as much here. This won't exactly be a problem since he'll just be displayed on my shelf anyway. The tricky part is that the socket needs to set around this fitted loop without getting the two of them stuck together. If you really wanted to reinforce these pieces, I feel like you could also glue this directly into his arm slot. The next piece we need to look at is this plate that pivots back and forth, driving his action feature. There's supposed to be 2 pins up top that move his arms, but you can see that one of them's broken off. I do have the piece, but I'm going to use a stronger replacement. I might be using the end of this push pin, but we'll see. To start this process, I'll first sand down the area to make a flat, even surface. I'll then use a pin vise to drill a small hole. It's always best to start small and work your way up if you're unsure how large your hole needs to be. So after some trial and error, I've decided to use the end of a paper clip. It really fits in there nice and doesn't want to move too much. After sizing the length up and making the cut, it's time to glue the new pin in. Both of these pieces that we just worked on are pieces that are going to be under some serious tension due to the action feature, so I'll be giving them a lot of time to dry. Okay, everything's ready to be put together, and this is definitely the most challenging part. It really becomes a three-hand job, so I have some dental floss here to help me out, and I'll show you how in a bit. Wolfman's got 3 moving parts, or 4 if you'd like to count his mouth and head separately, which they all need to be precisely in sync with each other. Now, part of his action feature is driven from this tiny spring. Be sure not to lose this. This attaches to the leg and is supposed to be anchored to this peg hole at the bottom. Now, just about all of his pegs had broken off when I cracked him open, so I had to force a bit of nail in there for something for the spring to hold on to. Once that's set, it's best to place the head, which is the other spring-loaded feature. The ends of the springs need to be facing away from his head. This creates the pressure that allows his mouth to open and close. This next piece is by far the most infuriating. It connects every piece, and if it's not perfectly 100% aligned, the entire assembly won't function. The idea is that this leg fork slides back and forth on this rail, and this piece moves his head and limbs. I should also mention that there's grease on both of these connections, so it wouldn't be a bad idea to apply some fresh grease here. What makes this piece so frustrating is that it doesn't snap in anywhere. It's just supposed to rest in these tiny grooves at the bottom, and his back piece is supposed to just sandwich it in place. The problem's that the slightest movement from any of his limbs makes this piece want to jump out of its position, so set it as best you can. And now's the time where you'll want to loop the dental floss over him and anchor the 2 ends to something else. Line the string up with the base of the pivot point and pull to hold the piece in place. Now you can set his arms with the shoulder socket hole facing down while looping his arm hoops through the top of the pins. I decided to thread nails through his socket holes that line up with the post holes on his torso piece for added support. This is because his original post had broken off. Now it's time for the most difficult part, placing the back torso on. I cannot stress enough how patient you need to be when you're doing something like this, because it requires a whole lot of fiddling. The slightest move makes the entire assembly want to just shift, and this just results in you resetting everything over and over and over again. Eventually, I was successful. Now you can remove the string and test it out. Initially, you'll want to be gentle just to be safe, but it looks like the action feature is fluid and we're ready to glue the weld back together. I'm very pleased with the way this guy turned out. In no way is he ready to be played with by kids, but he displays just the way I'd like him to. I like to think of him as set to retire and just be admired alongside my other Ghostbusters. And now that very small void in my childhood has been filled. I certainly hope you enjoyed this retro toy revive, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one.